Hello again and welcome back to my shop. It's been a couple of weeks since I've posted a video and I've been working on the Towers of Hanoi. It's a nice little game. The idea is to take these 10 discs and move them to this peg, one disc at a time, and you can never put a larger disc on top of a smaller disc. So without wasting any more time, let's get right into the video and I'll show you how I went about making this project. For the dowels that the discs will move back and forth on, I've got a really nice piece of hedge apple here. I'm going to take it to my lathe and I'm going to turn it down into a size that's suitable for this project. So what I want to do is I've got this jig that I made a while back. It is a stock centering jig for my lathe. I'm going to clamp the hedge apple into the jig and put a nice cross hatch on the bottom that my spur center can grip into. All right, got a nice cross hatch. Now this was a rectangular piece of wood, so that those cross marks are centered there. I'll turn this outside piece off. I'm not too worried about that. The dowel's probably going to be, I don't know, between 1/8 and 1/4 inch in thickness. I have my piece of hedge apple chucked up in the lathe, and if I turn the lathe on, you'll see it's running pretty smooth. So I'm happy with that. I'm going to go ahead now and turn this down somewhere between 1/8 inch and 1/4 inch in diameter. My hedge apple dowel is turned down to 1/4 inch. I was afraid to go any smaller because when you turn something this long and try to make it small, it gets a lot of play or a lot of vibration in the piece. I've sanded it down to 400 grit using mineral oil and wax to keep the dust down and to kind of condition the wood. I think I'm going to use a little bit of Triple E polish and some Shella wax to finish this dowel, and then I'll be able to cut it to length. It'll be cut into 3 pieces for the final project. For the 10 discs that I'll be building for this game, I milled up a piece of walnut and a piece of maple to roughly 1/8 inch. I made some test discs the other day on my circle cutting jig, and what I want to do is lay them on the walnut and the maple to get an idea of how large of a section I need to cut off to then go to the circle cutting jig and make my circles. My plan is to have my discs alternate between the walnut and the maple from the largest disc all the way down to the smallest. I just need to scribe some lines between each of the discs, and then I'll cut that section off of the larger board on the bandsaw. Once I have all of my sections cut out, I'll find center for each section, and then I'll drill a 5/64 inch hole at center, and then I'll be able to go to my circle cutting jig and get each of these discs cut out. Maybe a little hard to see on the walnut, but I have my lines scribed for each of my discs. I'm going to go ahead and get these segments cut out, and then we'll find center and move on to the circle cutting jig. And here are my 10 segments. Now I just need to find center, and we'll be ready to circle cut. And I've got all of my holes drilled in my blanks, and I'm ready to put them on my circle cutting jig and begin cutting my 10 discs. Only 9 more to go. For each successive disc, what I'll need to do is move this nail, which is the pivot point for my discs, down 1 segment on my jig. So let's go ahead and push it out the back. Move it down 1 hole. And we're ready for the next disc. And now we have our 10 discs of varying size. We will need to put a larger hole down the center of each disc so that they can slip onto the game dowel. They'll require a little bit of sanding and some finish, and they're going to be ready to go. I've got a nice piece of Jatoba here. This is an offcut from a floor, a hardwood floor someone had installed. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the tongue off of it first to get rid of that, and then I'm going to cut about a 3-inch wide section. Now my largest disc is 2 inches wide, so that gives me a 1/2 inch on both sides of the disc. That may be a bit much. I may end up trimming this down later, but I'd rather have the extra space because I'd like to maybe try rounding the edges over and with a round over bit. So I want to make sure I've got plenty of meat to be able to do that, and if I don't like what I've got, then I can always make it a little smaller, and I've got the ability to do that. So let's get the tongue cut off, and let's get it ripped down to about 3 inches. Alright, I have my piece of Jatoba laid out. You can see my 3 discs. I just took one of my 2-inch discs and measured as a 1/2 inch all the way around the disc and a 1/2 inch between the 2 discs. I've got a little piece on the end here to cut off so that it's perfectly symmetrical. I've got my base marked up. You can see there's 3 little divots in there. I've got a 1/4 inch Forstner bit chucked up, and I'm going to drill down the depth of the head of the Forstner bit into each of these holes. Just doing a quick dry fit. I've got the dowels inserted into the holes. Everything looks great. I've taken a ruler and measured, and I did a pretty decent job of keeping those on center. I need to round the tops over and get them glued in, but before we do, we're going to work on this base a little bit. I've brought all of my discs over to the drill press. It's time now to go ahead and put a 1/4 inch hole down through the center of all of them. After getting the holes drilled in the discs, I wanted to do a quick test fit to make sure that they fit okay, and it looks like everything fits fine. The dowels are a good size, so I should be able to go ahead now, and I'm going to finish the base up, and then we'll round over the tops of the dowels and get this thing put together. I cut the corners off of my base on the bandsaw, so I wasn't able to get a nice smooth curve, as smooth as I would like, so I cut it kind of fat. And now I'm just running it through the sander, through the spindle sander here, just to kind of smooth the corners off and get it ready to go to the router for roundover. To round out the top of my pegs, I decided just to chuck them up in my drill press. I've got some 60 grit sandpaper here, which will allow me to round this edge over really quick. And I've got some 220 to kind of polish it up, clean it up. And I'm just going to run the 220 over the entire surface and take some of that shallow wax off that I put on there because I want to clean it off so that the Danish oil that I'm going to use on the rest of the project can penetrate and get into the wood. I have all of the pieces of my game sanded down to 220 grit, and I have glued my dowels into my base. I picked up a little bit of Watco Danish oil, and what I'm going to do is go ahead and apply that to all of the pieces. It really brings out the beauty in the wood, doesn't it?
All that's left is let it dry for a while.
I'd like to say thank you for joining me in the shop. This was a fun project to make. It was a very simple project to make. I was able to make it out of shop scraps. I definitely will be making some more of these in the future. And as I go about making more, I'm going to make a few changes. Instead of turning my own dowels, I think I'm going to go ahead and buy 1/4-inch oak dowels to kind of cut down on the time. In regard to the discs, I'm going to use a 1/4-inch bolt, a nut, and a couple of washers, and I'm going to basically chuck these up in my drill and use my drill for sanding the edges because the edges were a challenge to sand. I'm also thinking about possibly rounding over the edges with that sanding jig. I hope you had as much fun watching this video as I had making it and making the Towers of Hanoi. If there's enough interest, I would consider doing a solution video to show you how to take this puzzle and work it from start to finish. I think I could probably time-lapse it and make it pretty quick. Let me know if you're interested in seeing that. And I hope some of you will consider getting out in your shop and giving this challenging little puzzle a try. If you've enjoyed my video today, I invite you to subscribe to my channel. Please consider liking this video, and as always, I love to hear your comments. Thank you, and have a nice evening.